Good morning and namaste to all of you. Let's start our Thursday class where we are studying the Prashnopanishad these days with some prayers. Om Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Parbrahma Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Om Bhu Bhuvaswaha Tat Savitra Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Nah Prachodayat Asto Ma Satgamya Tamso Ma Jyotirgamya Mrityorma Amritam Gamya ओम सहना भवतु सहना भुनक्तु सवीर्यं करवावहि तेजस्वी नावधीतमस्तु मां विद्विषावहि ओम शांति 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 ओम. Prashna Upanishads. Prashna means question, and there are six students, young students. They go to Rishi Piplad and they have these questions, these inquiries. So there are 6 chapters in this Upanishad, and each chapter has its question asked by one particular student. And we are on chapter 4, where Gargya is asking the Rishi Piplad, and this question is about sleep and dream. And we all sleep every night, and we go through the dream stage and the dreamless stage also. So it's very kind of a personal question to all of us. And how did he ask that question? Let's see, there are several parts to that question. He said, "Oh Bhagwan," see, that particular word itself tells us how much respect and the faith he has for the Guru. Bhagwan. What are they that sleep in a man? So that means when we are sleeping at night, what really sleeps? What again are awake? Which is the devata who sees the dream? Whose is this happiness? Because there is a happiness when we sleep. Otherwise, we wouldn't sleep if there was no happiness. So whose is this happiness? On what do all these depend? So these are all parts of that question about the sleep and the dream. Last time when we were together for this class, we ended with verse number 6 in this chapter, where Rishi Piplad says, when a mind is overpowered by light, what is that light? That is the light of our consciousness. Okay. When a mind is overpowered by light, that mind sees no dream. Okay. Otherwise, mind keeps on dreaming. At that time, bliss arises in body. Because the student was asking about the happiness, the bliss. Where does the bliss come from? What is the source of bliss? This is what Rishi Piplad is telling us. So today we're going to start the class with verse number 7 in this chapter number 4. Sa yatha somye veyansihi vaso vriksham sampratisthate evam have tat sarvam par atmani sampratishthe. Sa means he, yatha means as, somya means a young friend or a good looking person, somya. Vaso vriksham, the tree where they roost. Sampratishtante, run towards. Eva means so, her means verily. Tat means that, sarvam means all. Par means superior, upper. Atmani, in the Atma. Sampratishthe, go or established. So he is giving a little simile over here so that we can understand what really happens. Just as, oh beloved, birds retire to a tree for shelter. Okay? Because sometimes we wonder, where do the birds go at night? They retire in the trees. They hide themselves in the trees. So just as, O beloved, birds retire to a tree for shelter, so indeed all these rest in the Supreme Atma. Atmani Sampartishta. So beautiful analogy. We are all familiar with what happens to the birds. So this great Guru is bringing our mind to that. That means the indriyas, the senses, they merge into the mind. And when the mind, which is withdrawn from all its activities, for a set period of time, retires to revive to greater efficiency. And that's what we call we are sleeping. So in that dreamless sleep, it just retires. And next morning, when we come back to the waking condition, mind just starts fluttering again, just like the birds flutter outside the tree. And our mind also just goes towards the sense objects, seeking for some kind of a satisfaction in the outer world. Even though mind experienced that rest within, but habitually mind likes to go outside. So the statement that this folding up of the mind or its a temporary repose is like the flying of the birds back to their nests at the end of the day to rest and then again come out. It's a very powerful analogy, this. Because birds also, they only retire temporarily. They don't keep sitting in the trees. They are there only when they are tired. After they rest, they just feel that they are 100 times more energetic, more cheerful. And that's what happens to us also. We take rest at night, and then in the morning, we are again jumping out into this world of objects. Okay. So this bliss of Brahma, in our koshas, it's called Anandamay Kosh. That's what we felt, or that's what we feel every night. And that's where the mental rest comes from, or a feeling of bliss. Okay, let's read it again, just to make sure that it's clear to all of us. Just as birds retire to a tree for shelter, so indeed do all these rest in this Supreme Atma. So they just go inside. And all means the senses also, the mind also, the intellect also, the ego also. All the layers of the personality, they just retire and they go inward. But they are going inward unconsciously. But we can do the same more effectively consciously in our meditation. That's why it's said that if you meditate, even for a shorter period of time, you'll get a lot more benefit than an unconscious sleep. Or if you learn to sleep like a yogi, you will need only a small dose of sleep. Because yogis don't toss and turn. Their mind is in their control. Their senses are in their control. Their intellect is in their control. They can just go within right away. Okay, let's look at next beautiful verse. Prithvim cha prithvi matra cha apashaha apahmatraha cha tejas tejoh matraha cha vayushcha vayu matra cha akash matra cha chakshuscha drashtavyam cha shrotavyam cha granam cha घ्रातव्यम च रसश्च च रस यतवम च त्वक च स्पर्श यतव्यम च वाक च वक्तव्यम च हस्तोः च दातव्यम च उपस्थ च अनन्द्यत्वम च पायुश्च च विसर्ज्यत्वम च पादौ च गन्तव्यम च मनश्च च मन्तव्यम च बुद्धिश्च बोधतव्यम च अहंकारश्च अहंकृतव्य च चित्तम च चेतयितव्यम च तेजश्च विद्योतव्यम च प्राणश्च विधारयितव्यम च. See, our rishis, they wrote long verses just to make sure that we keep on doing pranayama. A person who does a lot of pranayama can recite these beautifully. So we got to practice that. Let me tell you the meanings, word by word, of this long verse. Prithvi, earth. Cha means and. Prithvi matra. Matra means the subtlety. So that is the subtle earth element. Okay. That's why tan matra. You remember the elements and then the tan matras. So this is what he is talking about. Prithvi, cha prithvi matra. So tan matra of the prithvi, the subtle earth element. Apaha, water. Apoh matra, the subtle water element. Tan matra of the water. Tejaha, light. Tejo matra, the light element. Vayu, the air. Vayu matra, the subtle air element. If I'm going too fast, stop me. Akashaha, the ether. Akash matra, the ether element. And in between there's a cha. Cha means and. You just keep breaking it down element by element. Chakshu, the eye. Drashtavyam, object of sight. Shrotram, the ear. Shrotavyam, the object of hearing. Granam, the smell. Gratavyam, the object of smell. Rasaha, taste. Rasityam, the object of taste. Tvak, the touch. Suparashiyatvam, the object of touch. Vak, speech. Vaktavyam, the object of speech. That means what can be spoken. Hastav, the two hands. Adatavyam, what can be taken. Upastha, the organ of generation. Anandiyatvam, the object of enjoyment. Payuhu, the organ of excretion. Visarjyatvam, the object of excretion. Padau, the two legs. Gantavyam, what can be walked upon. Manaha, the mind. Mantavyam, the object of thought. Buddhi, the intellect. Bodhavyam, the object of intellection. Ahankar, the ego. Ahamkritvam, the object of egoism. Chitam, the memory. Because memory is in the deeper part of our mind, which is called chitta. Chetiyatam, the object of memory. Tejaha, the light. Vidyot yitavam, what is to be lighted up. Pranaha, the prana, energy. vidharyetam, what can be held up. And at the end, it should be saying that etehe sarve atmane sampratishthantehe, all these rest in the Atma. Because in the previous one, he said they all go back to the Atma. Over here, he's explaining, he's elaborating what really goes into the Atma. He says the earth and its subtle elements, the water and its subtle elements, the Akash and its subtle elements, the eye and what can be seen, the ear and what can be heard, the nose and what can be smelt, taste and its objects, the hands and what can be grasped, the feet and what can be walked on, the organs of generation and what is to be enjoyed, the organs of excretion and what must be excreted, the mind and what must be thought of, the intellect and what must be determined, the egoism and its objects, Chit and its objects, the light and its objects, the pran and everything supported by it. All these rest in the state of sleep like birds in the nest. So they all merge over there, but remember, this is unconsciously during sleep. Again, I would emphasize that during meditation and samadhi, we do it consciously. So this enumeration of the functions in us that become inactive in the deep sleep condition. So this verse seems very long, but if you look at it, it's very simple. We all go through it every day. So the 5 great elements and their subtle elements, the tanmatras, because they represent their fundamental qualities. So they have their corresponding points in our sense organs. We are all familiar with the earth and the nose that smells, the water and the tongue that tastes. So that also retire. Fire and the eyes that perceive shapes, they retire too. Ear and the skin that feels touch. Akash and the ear that hears sound. All together, they constitute the macrocosm and the microcosm, sense organs of knowledge. Sounds are the property of the space, Akash. Whatever may be the sound that we hear, wherever it may be heard, they are all modifications of Akash. The same way all shapes, the shapes we recognize by the eye, they are only different variations of the fundamental shape, the shape of the fire. In every case. So that's why we are told here by this great Rishi Piplad, that the Indriyas with their objects completely retire in sleep. Not only the sense organs of knowledge, but even all the organs of action are put out in sleep. And the organs of action are 5 in number 2. The organs of speech, hands, legs, the instrument of procreation, and the equipment for excretion. He mentioned these also here in detail. Because each of them individually has its own function. To speak, to lift, to walk, to procreate, enjoy, and to excrete. So the verse describes that all the instruments of action with their activities retire in sleep. So apart from the organs of action and knowledge, even the inner instrument of perception, feeling, and comprehension retire also. The inner instrument is man, buddhi, chit, ahankar, mind, intellect, chit, and ego. And we all know their independent functions are thinking, determining, illuminating, and self-ascertaining. They all retire in sleep. And in the last section of this verse says that pran and what is to be supported by it also retire. And if you paid attention in the previous verses, he said that prans don't retire. Over here, he says pran retires. Let me tell you, there's no contradiction. Over here, when he says pran, he's meant only that particular branch of activity of the pran, functioning of the pran. It retires. By virtue of which the sense organs of perception were functioning in the waking state. That's all he mentions. Functioning of the excretion. So those kind of things is saying that pran retires. So the officer in charge of the sense organs, they were termed as pran. And the pran is at rest in the sleeping man. That functioning part. So the sum total of this whole verse is that altogether constitutes the ahankar or the ego center in all its fields of activities. Ahankar. So the factor which identifying with the above mentioned different entities constituting a person becomes the ego center. That ego center is the one which arrogates to himself the feeling that I am the sufferer, I am the enjoyer in life. And we'll see that he'll further expand on it in the next verse. Okay, so this big looking verse, when you learn it word by word, it's very easy to grasp. Let's look at verse number 9 now. Eshahi drashtaha suparshtaha shrotaha grahata rasyata mantaha bodhaha kartaha vigyanatmaha purushaha sapare akshrehe atmane sampratishthe. Esha. Esha means he. He means verily. Drashta, the seer. Saprashtaha, he who feels. Shrotaha, the hearer. Grata, he who smells. Rasayata, he who tastes. Mantaha, the thinker. Bodhaha, the perceiver. That means the knower. Kartaha, the doer. Vigyan Atmaha, the self of knowledge. Purushaha, the person. With all the qualifying adjuncts, the Purushaha. So means he. Pare means supreme. Aksharehe, imperishable. Atmani, in the Atma. Sampartishthehe, is established. That is who sees, feels, hears, smells, tastes, thinks, knows. He is the doer. the intelligent ego, the Purusha. He dwells in the highest indestructible self. The active agent in life's turmoils, who feels the successes in the victories and failures and the sorrows, is the ego center. And that ego center helplessly floats along like a pathetic, dazed body. It's in the waters of the time and the circumstances, it just keeps on moving. And this ego center is a product of our identification with our body, with our mind, with our intellect. And this is the one who has the delusory arrogance to claim that he is the actor, the perceiver, the enjoyer, the knower. In short, the intelligent, knowing soul, Vigyan Atma, know its own delusory extensions of something different from itself. And due to its wrong perception, we feel the sorrow and the limitations and the finiteness of this existence, or even the mortality. Because the Atma doesn't die, what dies? Only the Prakriti changes. Actually, Prakriti doesn't die either. But we identify ourselves only with that shape and we just feel sorrow. So over here, Rishi Piplad, he's hammering on this fact with the help of this, even just a sleep, the phenomena which we go through every day, that the ego center in us gets drowned in the mist of ignorance, and the consequent unknown bliss is the experience of sleep. So even in our sleep, we feel that bliss. And if we are fully established in it all the time, if we are awake, not only when we are sleeping, but we are awake when we are even roaming around, what kind of a bliss we will feel. That's where he's taking us. Because this delusory ego has no vitality of its own. This ego is just a superimposition upon the Atma. And Atma is the highest indestructible self. But we call ourselves self as the ego. Just like a ghost does not have any existence apart from the ghost, or the snake doesn't have the existence apart from the rope. So when there is such a self in us, apart from what we generally know as the ego center, certainly this great teacher is giving us details after details to get to know ourselves. And next verse, we'll see a beautiful description, which is very easily understandable by us. This is the beauty of these scriptures. Those students, they were young, but they had a faith in the teacher. They did all the early requirements also. They did the tapasya. They cleansed themselves before they sat down near the feet of their Guru. Let's see what he says in the next verse. Param ev aksharam pratipadyate sa yoha vah tad akshayam shariram alohitam shubhram aksharam vedyate ya astu soumya sarvagyaha sarvo bhavati tadesh shalokaha. Param, the supreme. Aksharam, indestructible. Pratipadyate, attains. Sa means he, ya means who, her, where, assuredly. Tat means that, akshayam, shadowless. She like a chaya, shadowless. Ashariram, bodiless. Alohitam, colorless. Lohit normally means red, but over here it really means the color. So colorless. Shubhram, pure. Aksharam, indestructible. Vedyate, knows. Ya too, and who again? Soumya, my young friend. Sa means he. Sarvagya, the omniscient. All-knowing. Sarvaha, all. Bhavati becomes. Tat means about that. Eshaha, the following. Shalokaha, verse. From the, we have seen this in this particular Upanishad. To make a greater emphasis, Rishi Kumar is bringing the verse from the Mantra Upanishad also. Okay, so because this is a Brahman Upanishad, so from the Mantra Upanishad, the shlok is going to recite. So this is verse number 10. One who, O beloved, knows this being, who is without shadow, without body, without color, which is pure and indestructible, becomes omniscient and becomes all. The supreme, the indestructible being, he surely attains. For this, there is a mantra. So he says, I'm not just saying it. Don't even take my word for it. Look at that. The humility of a great teacher. So this verse is describing the reality behind the delusion created ego. The ego is established in pure awareness and all the other faculties, which are the body, the mind, and the intellect. That's why we start identifying ourselves with the body. Something happens to the body and we are lost. Even a comment from here and there. These are all mere superimpositions upon the truth. Just like a blueness or a murkiness upon the clearless sky. Ego center, which has realized its error, comes to experience itself to be nothing other than the pure consciousness, the reality. And this is the goal of our life. This is the goal of our existence in this beautiful human body. to realize who we are. This is the mission of human life, I should say, which we forget. We just divert ourselves into the gutters. But having attained it, this great Rishi is telling us, he says there's no reason why we should feel even for a moment the limitations. Those limitations are just the fumes of the ignorance in us and the ravings of the ego. He is telling us what this infinite is. Anytime we have a question what the infinite in us is, he says, it doesn't have any shadow, it doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a body. It is pure, it's indestructible. Once we realize it, we'll know that this is who we are and this is Brahman. So what would be that reality? That was the question posed by the student. So infinite cannot be described in words, because the language can express only the finite things. Language can tell this is big or this is small. This is the shape. This is the color. Infinite cannot be described. Only the finite things can be described. But we can experience it though. That's why he said, becomes omniscient and becomes all. Supreme, the indestructible being, he surely attains. These words cannot be understood intellectually. They cannot be spoken with this mouth. We got to, first of all, combine these, because neither the language of the head nor the language of the heart alone can understand it. We got to combine it, and that is the language of intellect, emotion. Only then we can understand what does it really mean, which is without shadow. So shadow is actually word used over here to amplify everything which has been discussed earlier. All reflections. Because wherever there is a reflecting medium, in all those places we see the sun reflected. Whether we see it in the river or whether we see it in the pool. Those are all pluralistic reflections. And if we were to inquire into the cause of the reflections, we will certainly say that it's the sun. Sun is separate from all its reflections. So that's why this Rishi is explaining with all these analogies to us. He's trying to point out the reality whose reflection is the ego center. Just as we understand the sun as something separate from its own reflection, here the truth is described as without shadow. It's a very deep term over here. Try to understand it. Transcending the ego, we experience the reality. Transcending the ego, not with the help of the ego. Sublimation of the ego is the process by which the awareness in us becomes aware of itself. And that is called the experience of the reality. And when he says without body, in denying a body to the Supreme, we are denying all forms to the Supreme. Because form is the signboard of matter which is finite and perishable. Finite. Only when a thing is conditioned by something other than itself, it can have a form. You and I got a form because of the material of space surrounding us. But in denying thus a form to the supreme reality, the Shruti over here, the Upanishad, by implication is saying that it's homogeneous. It's all pervading. In fact, this kind of a all pervading factor, which is one without a second, ever unconditioned, alone can be the truth supreme, which is eternal and infinite. And when he says without body, he also means that supreme reality is that state of experience. When we have transcended all three bodies, what are the all three bodies? The gross body, the subtle body, and the causal body. The Sathul Sharir, Suksham Sharir, and Karan Sharir. At least during our meditation, let go of these three bodies, then you will experience it. And when he says without color, over here, color really means desires. Supreme is without desire. And it's pure and indestructible. There is nothing in the infinite, in the supreme, which can be touched by impurity. It's all pure. So from all these negations, it's very clear. The eternal factor, the self, is without any attributes. That's why it's indestructible. Because all things destructible have some kind of an attribute, or they manifest. So over here, this great Rishi is saying it's indestructible because there's nothing to destroy. It's attributeless. And it becomes omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing. It's not the mind becomes all-knowing. Mind cannot become all-knowing. Intellect can never become all-knowing. Ego center can never become all-knowing. It becomes omniscient. See, in our day-to-day context, when we gain knowledge in this world, we call it a knowledge of the things. And that is a conditioned knowledge. Why? Because that is a knowledge conditioned by the objects. Whether it's a knowledge of the computers or knowledge about any other secular science, it is a knowledge conditioned by objects. And in this process of knowing, there is the awarer, the awareness, and the object of the awareness. In this conditioned knowledge I'm talking about. But in transcending the mind and intellect, the ego comes to experience its essential nature as pure consciousness. Awareness of awareness. What happens in the process is it becomes awareness of itself. That's why this little symbol, not the body, not the mind, not the intellect, I want to join with that Supreme, eternally. The awareness or consciousness, whatever you want to call it, in an individual, which is the self, is all pervading reality. All pervading. Awareness in every being is one and the same. There are no two kinds of Atmas. No two kinds of consciousnesses. Since without awareness, knowledge of thing is not possible, we can say that awareness is omniscient. Every knowledge known, anywhere, at any time, by anyone. This kind of awareness, this kind of experience will be the same, whether it happened in Satyug or whether it happens in Kali Yuga, whether it happens in America or in India, whether it happens to a female gender or to a male, or young or old, this is the same. Always in the presence of this pure awareness, and such awareness is omniscient. It being the self of all, knower of the self, experiencing selfhood, become all. And here the Rishi is quoting a Vedic mantra in support of this, but he just mentioned it to his students. And we'll look at that next week. Om Purnamada Purnam Idam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vishishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you very much.